This is Jim Bratton Podcast. You may enjoy some, or all, or none. Now, here's Jim.
So this is the Jim Bratton Podcast, and we're talking to Jim Boone. Jim Boone is arguably the oldest poet on Galveston Island. You told me that, and I believe you, okay?
I think I am.
Anyway, it's nice to have you with us, okay? And we're in conference room 206 at Marmo here. Listen, I've reviewed through a bit of your bio, and there's just so much. Do you want to take it chronologically and sort of how all this stuff happened? Well, number one,
me.
You've lived a lot of years.
I have.
There's a hell of a story to tell here.
Yeah. I've been around a long time and didn't expect to be.
Yeah, well, it's sort of me too. And you're still an active poet.
Yes.
Still presenting.
Yes.
I mean, you're all over the island.
Yes.
And have read some of your stuff. It was summed up by somebody. It said it's got you have your own sense of lyricalness. Is that the right word?
That is a very good word, yes.
Perhaps as we wrap up today, we might take, if you've got one that's a minute or so that we can read something.
I can do that.
So we can talk about it now, but then they'll actually hear it listeners will hear it as we wrap things up.
All right.
All right. You were born?
March 24th, 1937. Yes, and I grew up in McKinney, Texas.
Right.
And I came back to McKinney after many years living in Houston because my mother was alone and she needed looking after. And I thought, I know if I don't do it, my brother who lived in Dallas would never.
I understand.
So I went. And while I was there, I got outed as a poet. And
so how long ago was this?
It was, I grew up in the 40s and 50s.
Right.
Well, I've heard all of these horror stories from different people that I meet over the years about being born gay, but not knowing what that was. And when they expressed themselves, their parents would just,
right.
No,
Didn't exist.
And the stories about kids being taken to doctors and the doctors giving them shock treatments to change their way of living and all of that stuff. And I thought, from the get-go, when I knew something was not the same with me and the rest of the folks in the house, I didn't know what it was, but I knew that, well, that's just me. Now let's learn to deal with it.
So did you learn or embrace? We're not even talking about your poetry, and listen to it. And it takes us a couple of programs to get to your poetry. So be it.
Okay.
This is a meaningful story.
Well, growing up in the 40s and
Yes.
being a little kid my great aunt Dixie, who lived down the street from us, I would go over and sit on her front porch with her. And she told me one day, a few years later, she said, honey, she said, I told Clarence, that was her husband, that Jimmy Boone, he may have lace on his skivvies, but he's smarter and got a better heart than anybody in his family. Lace on his skivvies.
Lace on your skivvies.
I thought that was...
I've heard all kinds of analogies, okay?
So then she said something to me one day. She said, I see all of these yard dogs running around when you're out riding your tricycle and stuff. And she said, honey, you got to try and stay away from them because, she said, they're up to no good. And, I knew that whatever it was that they were doing, many years later, when I told someone this, they said, oh, so as a child you were molested? I said, I never thought of it as that way. I said, it was the first time that anybody ever showed me any kind of fondness or caring. Nobody at home did. And everybody was. So I never saw it that way. And as a
was your
result,
family, but you had an early total awareness.
total awareness, and I refused to let them convince me otherwise.
How was your family?
Pardon?
How was your family on
How were they?
how were they in terms of made
Let's
aware?
put it this way. When I got into junior high school and high school, my dad sat me down and he said, from now until you graduate from high school, you are to be in this house by 6 o'clock for dinner, and you will not leave this house until you go to school the next morning. And I will not have you out on the streets because there's no telling what will happen that will embarrass your mother and I. So then when I went to my 50th high school reunion, they were talking about all this stuff they used to do. And this one woman said to me, she said, you never were with us on any of these escapades that we had. And I told her, and she said, well, hell, honey, she said, we all knew you were weird and funny, but she said, I had no idea that your parents had you locked up. And I said, well, basically, that's what it was. I wasn't allowed to leave home as long as I was old enough to embarrass them.
Was it all about embarrassment, or was there some protection for you implicit in that as well?
I never felt that they had any intentions of any protection.
So there was nothing good about this then.
There really wasn't, because when I was a little kid in before grade school and when I was in grade school, they would give me quarters to go to the movies.
Yeah.
Because there were 4 movie theaters around the town square, and we were 4 blocks from the town square.
Yeah.
They'd give me, and they'd say, just go and spend the day at the movies.
Right.
And I heard my mother tell my aunt on the phone one day, she said, it's one way of keeping him quiet. She said, he's just yapping on about stuff all the time. And so, but I had to be at home at night. They weren't protecting me. They just figured that I couldn't get into too much trouble in the daytime, which was not true. But
they just didn't want the embarrassment.
They didn't want any embarrassment with me interacting with the kids that I went to school with. So,
is that when you began to ponder things that may have led you to become a poet?
Well,
I mean, because you had time to think.
I didn't have anybody to talk about things that were going on here, and so I would write stuff.
Yeah.
And then my mother would find it, and she'd say, don't be, and she'd tear it up, throw it away. So I got better at hiding what I was writing. And
did you also get your memory to work better, where you could keep a lot in your head?
Yes. But I remember the first time that I ever said anything to her about a gay friend of mine.
How old were you then?
Oh, I was.
You're grown up now.
I had come back to McKinney. I was in my 50s. I had come back to McKinney.
Oh, this is when you came
I had come back to McKinney to look after her.
Yeah.
And she started in on this ranting about, oh, this, that, and the other. And I thought, you have just absolutely had all of this hatred going on for having to put up with me all these years. And so it was very strange. And I wrote a couple of poems about all of that. But I never would let anything bog me down. Like, as soon as I got out of high school, I wanted to just hit the road and start researching what was going on, and is anybody else like me out there? And of course, my parents said, well, no, your brother's in college, and you've got to go to college too, because you won't amount to anything if you don't. And I said, well, I really don't want to go. I wasn't that good of a student in high school. Well, you need to go. So I went, and my brother graduated.
Where'd you go to school then?
North Texas at Denton.
Yeah.
And my brother graduated at the end of my freshman year, and I thought, I've just got to get out of here. Well, it took me 3 years to get bad enough grades to get thrown out. Then after I got thrown out, I went to work, and within a couple of months, I got a letter from Uncle Sam,
There you go.
and I got drafted into the Army.
Yeah.
Well, my dad's cousin, Arthel, who lived out on the family farm, he pulled me aside one day and he said, "I heard that you got a physical coming up in Dallas." I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I'll tell you what." He said, "They'll give you paperwork to fill out, and one of the questions says, 'Are you homosexual?' And you check yes, and they will show you the door." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And he says, "It means what you are and what I am." And so after I left there, I got to thinking about it, and I thought, okay, now if I pass the physical, I'm guaranteed of 2 years active duty with nothing but about hundreds of young men.
Yeah.
And if I say, yes, I am, they'll kick me out, and here I'll be out here.
Right.
So I checked no, and they sent me right on. They sent me to a bus, took me to a train, put me on a train, and took me to Fort Walters to do basic training.
Yeah. And so you served what?
Well, I got sent to Korea,
Yeah.
but it was post-war time,
Right.
so I got to go to Japan.
Wow.
And I loved Japan. So every time I got to leave,
Yeah.
I would go to Japan. And I went, after the first time that I went straight to the bullet train and went to Kyoto.
Right.
Because when I was in the 5th grade, the teacher went around the room one day and she said, "Now, each of you tell me where you would like to go if you could go anywhere you wanted
Right.
to." And, people say Hollywood,
Right.
whatever. And when she came to me, I said, "Kyoto, Japan." And she said, "Well, why in the world did you have uncles in the war that
Yeah.
told you about that?" And I said, "No, ma'am." And she said, "Well, why in the world?" I said, "Well, I think I lived there."
Yeah,
She said, "Now, Jimmy Boone,
oh, Jimmy Boone. I can hear them saying that.
you have lived here all of your life. You have not lived." I said,
Not this life.
"Not this time."
I know where you're going with
And
this.
when I said that, she sent a note home to my mother, and my mother read it, and she said, "When are you going to learn to quit talking foolish to people?" Well, so I made it to Kyoto.
You did. And got to visit your previous life.
Yes. So, yeah.
Wow. So the Army was a good experience for
It
you.
was a very good experience. I had my first 4 boyfriends
Yeah.
in the Army.
Yeah.
That's one thing that I found out, that when you put a lot of males together, they're going to get along.
Right.
They don't have any females to impress,
Yeah.
and so whatever, oh, well, that's fine. And
Statistically, you were bound to run into somebody else.
yeah.
I mean, the odds just were there.
And I mean, people always knew what they said they didn't know about,
I know.
When I was a little kid, they'd see me pedaling up down the street, and they'd say, "Oh, that one's sweet." And here they'd come. But
Wow. Quite a development. So 3 years in the Army.
yes, and then I got home in time to go to a parade.
Oh, yeah, you'd given me this in some of your pre-notes. This is the...
I was working at a men's store in Dallas.
Right.
And they had a store downtown and one out by SMU University.
Right.
And I was working at the one at SMU. But when we heard that Kennedy was coming to Dallas and there was going to be a parade,
Oh, my.
I begged them to let me take our delivery van and go downtown and take a delivery. And when the parade was over, come back out. And so they said, "Okay, you can do that." So I went. And I stood on the street and I watched the parade go by. And it was just great. I saw them almost as close as you
Yeah.
are. And I was so thrilled. Then it went on, and I got back in the van. I went out to the other store, and when I walked in the door, they were all just, I said, "What's the matter? What's the matter with you all?" And then when they told me,
What an emotional moment.
I couldn't believe it. And Mr. Hoffman, the owner, he had locked the store and put close sign on, and we all just sat there, just dumbfounded.
Dumbfounded, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I was not. I was in high school, so I wasn't. I was aware, but it didn't hit as it would have had I been a little bit older.
Yeah.
But I guess it's analogous to the way a lot of us felt with 9/11, just shaken to the core.
Yes. Well, when 9/11 happened, I was working for Freddie Mac in Dallas, and I went into our break room that morning,
Yeah.
and I was getting some coffee, and I looked up at the TV screen, and I thought, well, what is that? And I saw the first plane fly into the Twin Towers.
Right.
Well, somebody else came walking on. I said, "This is live." I said, "A plane just flew into the," and they said, "Well, it must have been some kind of a private plane if they," and, but then we stayed there and we're watching it. And a couple of other people come in and they said, "I just heard something on the radio." I said, "Well," and we sat there and watched the whole thing.
Right. I saw the second plane fly in.
Yes, I did
We were,
too.
and it was live. It was live. No, I mean,
I know
it was a
I
damn
couldn't
thing.
believe it
No,
because when you knew one had already hit and you see that other one coming, it's like,
You're
what?
stunned. You're stunned.
And I remember after all was said and done, I had a friend who lived in New York and worked in Manhattan, and I called him and I said, "Oh, this is just awful." And he said, "Well, what?" He said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I've been hearing a lot of sirens going on, but we don't know what's happening."
Oh my.
And so I told him, and he said, "Holy shit." Well, he called me that night and he said all of the subways and everything were shut down. And those of us that lived in the boroughs had to walk across the bridge and catch taxis.
Right.
After we got into wherever we lived.
You journaled. I mean, when you wrote this stuff down as a kid, I guess you would call that journaling now.
Yeah.
Was that the basis of some of your poetry?
Oh, of course.
When did you begin to think of yourself as a poet?
Okay.
Because we've got you through the Army, Freddie Mac.
While I was working for Freddie Mac, I was living in McKinney.
Right.
I went to work at Freddie Mac in 1990, and in 1992, I met this young woman who had a really cool art gallery and gift shop. And I was talking to her one day, and she said, my great aunt Ruth Dowell was your high school English teacher. And I said, "My senior English teacher?" "Yes, she was." And I said, "She would be so surprised to learn that I do any kind of writing." And she said, "Oh, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I just journal things." And she said, "Oh, I'd love to read some of it." And I said, "Oh, I don't know." And I said, I almost failed her class because I wouldn't get up and recite something that she required of us. And she said, "Well, what was that?" And I said, "We had to memorize the first 21 lines of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales."
Right.
And we had to recite it. Each one of us had to recite it in a class when she would ask us to. And I said, we got to the end of the year and she said, "Boone, you have not done this yet, and this is your last chance." And I said, "I'm sorry, but I just can't." I said, "I can sit here." And she said, "No, you have to stand up and face the class." I said, "I'm sorry, I can't do that." Finally, it got about 5 minutes to the bell, and she said, "Stay in your seat." So when they left, she let me sit there and recite it to her, and she said, "Okay, get out of here." And so Nina said, "I can't tell you how many people that when I get to know them and they know who I am, tell me this story." And I said, "Well," she said, "Can you recite it?" And I stood right there and recited the whole thing to her. And she said, That's just amazing. I said, I know. I said, I can't believe that I knew it all, but
It's still in there.
it's still there. And then when I would go to class reunions, we'd have contests to see who could go the longest. And it was just
So, but still not thinking of what you were writing as poetry.
right. And one day I finally took some stuff to her, and
Yeah.
she said, "This is some of the best poetry I've ever read." She said, "You write about stuff that I think about." And she said, "I love it." She said, I want you to consider doing some public readings." And I said, "I don't even know where I would do it if I would," but I said, "I can't do that." And she said, "Well, libraries and things." So one day I was sitting in a coffee shop and I was reading the local paper,
Right.
and it said, Nina Dowell Ringley is going to start a venue at the old Ritz Theater building called the Eclectic Word. And for the first one, she's going to feature a local poet and native, Jim Boone, who's going to read his original poetry. Called her and I said, "Nina, you know I told you I can't." She said, "Aunt Ruth and I think it's time." So I got myself a music stand, a stool. The people were here. My stool was here, and the stand was here, and I had everything on paper that I read.
Right.
And Nina said, "I wish we had phone cameras on our phones back in those days," because she said, "You after you read 2 poems that way, and you started on the third one," she said everybody in the room, you could tell they knew what was going on, because she said you came off of that stool and you walked around the stage and you would read some and you would look around, and she said it was just wonderful to watch. And she said you experienced what was going on at the end of it, because everybody that was there lined up and came up on the stage and gave me
Oh,
great
my.
job, great job.
Wow.
From that day on, you couldn't shut me up.
Wow. And that was relatively late in life.
Age 56.
That's very impressive.
Age 56.
Now, did you resurrect some previous writings, or you been writing fresh stuff ever since
no,
then?
I dug into everything that I'd ever written and started, reworking it. And some would just end up being a title for a poem.
Right.
But then after after a year, I started venturing out and getting to know some people in the Dallas area that were different poetry groups,
Open mic style places.
and doing things with them. And this one that I went to in Garland, Texas, the guy had a art gallery, and we would go once a month. And in 1997,
Yeah.
he said, "I got an email from a group in New York that's doing a demonstration on the Mall in Washington, D.C. for additional funding for the National Endowment for the Arts. And they're asking for volunteers to come and participate."
Right.
And he said, "My wife and I are going to go, and I wonder if you'd like to go." And I said, "Well, let's see. I'll see when is it, and if I can get off from work." Well, the whole thing worked. I went to Washington, D.C., and got up there on the stage and read 2 of my poems and had on a shirt that was a Texas flag. And somebody was interviewing me after it was over with, and they said, "Well, you can tell you're a Texan because you're wearing your flag right up there and proud of it." So all of a sudden, I was just doing all this stuff. And
So you were a poet.
Yes. Hey, I am a poet.
Yeah.
Son of a gun. And I took a writing class from
Right.
this one poet that would come to Dallas once a year and teach classes. And at the end of it, I said, "People are always asking me what kind of poetry I write, and I don't know what to say." And he said, "Jim, You tell them you're a proof of life poet. I said, oh, I like that. He said, that's what you are.
Proof of life. When I read some of your stuff, I mean, you have your own meter to it, and it's borders on traditional, but it's not.
Right, right. Well, somebody asked me in later years, they said, you talk about being gay, but you don't write like we expect to hear a gay poet. And I said, well, the only thing I can say is that I knew that part of my life, it was such a focus because I was bound and determined that I was going to find out what that was all about. And I said, but I also knew life has to be more than about your sexuality.
Right.
So I wanted to concentrate on writing about other things that I thought about. And I said, as a result, I lived the sexuality part and I wrote about everything else. And now, every once in a while, when I do a poetry thing at the Proletariat or wherever, I will do a gay poem that I have constructed between then and now. And people say, oh, I love that. And yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, that you haven't focused on that in your poetry.
No, I haven't.
And hardly at all. I mean,
I was too focused on that in everyday life because everybody told me that, well, first of all, when you start hearing stories about parents having shock treatments done to their kids, and when you discover that there's a bar that you can go to where people like me usually go, and then you go there and the police come in and walk around, and if you're even touching somebody on the arm, they haul you off to jail.
Right.
And if somebody decides they don't like you and they know that you're involved with someone and that if somebody shows up at this certain time, they're going to catch you doing stuff that you're not supposed to do.
Understood.
And I know of a couple of people that got thrown in prison for 20 years for having sex with another male. And so I thought, I got to keep my wits about me while I'm researching all of this, but I didn't have time to write about it.
No, I like it. You lived it.
I lived it, and then I wrote about life. 1966, after I got I was out of the Army, I was living in Dallas. I had had a lot of bad experiences with other gay people. And I just really got sick and tired of the whole thing. And I thought, I have lived quite a life. I've been halfway around the world. I have done this and that. And I'm just sick and tired of all of this. And I went over to a friend's house and was visiting with her. And I went into the bathroom, opened up the medicine cabinet, and there was a bottle of sleeping pills. I got it. I went home, got some water, took half the pills, took the other half, and then I thought, this is a shitty thing to do to her, and you need to call and let her know that don't feel bad. So and I call and I'm just going on and on. Well, immediately she dropped the phone on her bed and got in her car and was headed to where I lived. She got the guy that lived across the hall to help put me in her car, and she drove me to Parkland Hospital, and I had my stomach pumped out. You will never do that again if you have your stomach pumped out.
I can only imagine.
Whoa. My angels, whatever, this isn't it. This isn't.
You still had to write a lot of poetry.
You've got a long road to hoe. So, yeah.
Wow. Hey, we're going to wrap up in a little while. But tell me about this, being nominated to be proletariat.
Well, when I came to Houston, to Galveston in 2007,
Right.
and in 2011, I got an email from a man Jake Sitters, who lived in Castroville, Texas.
Right.
He was 82 years old, and he wanted me to know that he had been reading a lot of my poetry that I had posted on a national website called poemhunter.com.
I've seen that, yes.
And he said, I am so thrilled with your poetry and what you've written, that he said, I just wanted to let you know that I've nominated you for Poet Laureate. And I said, oh my Lord. I said, I worked with a man at Freddie Mac in Dallas who was a Texas Poet Laureate. And he said, no, sir. He said, I nominated you to the U.S. Library of Congress to be the U.S. Poet Laureate. And I said, well, I can assure you that I'm not going to get that. And he said, well, we'll see. But he said, I can assure you that the rest of your life you will be a nominee.
Huh. What a beautiful thing.
And I was just,
yeah.
And then I had told a friend of mine here, and he said, well, that's just great. And unbeknownst to me, he called a friend of his at the Daily News and said, I think this is a story for your paper. And he said, I think you're right.
It certainly is.
And they called me. They sent somebody over to where I lived. They took pictures. They did a story in 2012. But there were a couple of people that wrote into the paper and said, I do think that nomination would have been better used if they had nominated so and so that are on faculty at the college or whatever. And I just sent a nice little reply back, and I said, you probably are right. Why haven't you nominated them?
There you go. We could keep going for a much longer time, okay? But I'm comfortable where we are. We've covered a lot of ground. You got anything? You got a verse or two you'd like to give us to close out the program that you got in memory?
I've got one that has become my signature poem, and that is, out on a limb is the only place to be on the tree of life, not sleeping in the shade, not clutching and afraid, but scaling to the heights of imagination and possibility, going out on a limb poised for flight. Worry not about falling. You can only get bruised, broken, or meet your maker there. When you go out on a limb, dance, dance.
Wow. What a great way to wrap up this podcast. This has been a very nice conversation with Jim Boone. You'll find his contact information on the header of this podcast. This has been the Jim Bratton Podcast from Room 206 at Marmo. We've been talking to Jim Boone. Thank you for joining us.
This has been Jim Bratton Podcast. We hope you have enjoyed, been inspired, informed, angered, or otherwise emotionally stimulated. This is your booth announcer, Sierra Sakel.